afternoon and welcome to the webinar on human rights in Egypt. I am Diana Naji, the Head of Advocacy at the Democracy Center for Transparency. We are honored to have you all with us today. We cordially welcome Mr. Fabio Massimo Castaldo, MEP, the Vice President of the European Parliament. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
We are also privileged to have Ms. Maria Laura Françoisi, the chair-founder of Brussels Press Club and a journalist on European affairs. Thank you for joining us. We are also delighted by Dr. Leslie Piekmal, Senior EU Advocacy Representative at Cairo Institution for Human Rights Studies. Thank you for joining us. And finally, it's our pleasure to have Mr. Tarek Mahmoud, an Egyptian journalist and former head of the Office of Egyptian News Agency, MENA. Welcome and thank you for being with us. In a moment, we are going to hear from all of you, and thank you again for being with us. Mr. Castaldo, I would like to begin with you. We would love to hear your reflection on the reality of human rights violations in Egypt with reference to some cases.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here together with you. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin really by thanking once more the Democracy Center for Transparency for the organization of this event and for inviting me to open discussion on such a topical issue, and especially being the Vice President in charge of human rights and democracy for the European Parliament. I'm really delighted to share some remarks together with you today. First of all, let me also thank to our honorable guests of today, starting from Mrs. Maria Laura Françoisi, Mrs. Leslie Piekmal, and my colleague also, Samira Raffaela, and also Dr. Tarek Mahmoud. Finally, I also want to thank all of you that are following us today for this debate. Given the outstanding level of today's speakers, I'm sure that this moment of discussion, your insights, your comments, and the proposals will provide the interesting inputs into the work of each of us in our respective roles, together also with the chance to come up with concrete outcomes, practical ideas, and also on how to cooperate, how we cooperate to improve the human rights situation in Egypt that is absolutely tragic nowadays. Since President Al-Sisi took power in 2014, in fact, the human rights situation in Egypt has deteriorated catastrophically and without precedent in the country. Just over a year ago, in September 2019, the Egyptian authorities responded with a violent crackdown and a massive wave of arrests on thousands of peaceful protesters across Egypt who took to the streets to demonstrate against the high-level corruption in government and in the military, as well as austerity measures. Over the course of this year, the situation has not improved, unfortunately, but further worsened, on the contrary, as highlighted by the November Universal Periodic Review at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, where Egypt received strong criticism and scores of recommendations. Through a series of draconian laws and repressive tactics of its security forces, the government of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has orchestrated a coordinated campaign to strengthen its grip on power, further eroding the independence of the judiciary and imposing stifling restrictions on the media, NGOs, trade unions, political parties, and independent groups and activists. The authorities continue to severely restrict human rights organizations and Parliament expanded the role of military courts in prosecuting civilians and further undermined the independence of the judiciary. The Supreme State Security Prosecution, the so-called SSSP, ordered the detention of thousands pending investigation in relation to vaguely worded terrorism-related charges. It is extremely undefined inside the Egyptian penal law. Extensive use of exceptional courts led to a grossly unfair trials and in some cases death sentences. In many cases, I would say, not just in some. Those arrested on political charges are often subject to enforced disappearances, prolonged pretrial detention, solitary confinement, and excessive use of force. Execution continued, torture remained rife in normal and informal places of detention. And about the pretrial detention, let me say that it's very usual inside in the Egyptian judiciary when the period has expired to again reiterate this measure, changing a bit eventually the charge and continuing for an undefined time that is absolutely contrary of any determination of rule of law, and also it's contrary to the international covenant that Egypt signed up. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the repression of political prisoners in Egypt has shown no sign of ceasefire. Tens of thousands of prisoners remain incarcerated nowadays for peacefully exercising their rights to freedom of expression, protest, and assembly, while the country's prisons are crowded and hygiene in general in these prisons is extremely poor, raising serious concerns about the potential spread of the disease under such terrible conditions of detention. Among them, I want to recall the case of Patrick Zaki, an Egyptian researcher who was studying in Italy, now has been in Egyptian jail for 9 months, while the charges against him are never being discussed. A case that the Italian government and diplomatic body is following closely, and that has sparked outrage in the public opinion as it recalled the case of Giulio Regeni, another young Italian researcher allegedly brutally murdered by the Egyptian security forces in 2016. Patrick and Giulio's stories are inextricably linked to that of many Egyptian activists in detention, perpetually persecuted for their activism and dedication to the protection of fundamental rights. Human rights violations under the Egyptian authoritarian government, however, do not only materialize in the violent repression of dissidents, but also in the continued repression of women's rights, which continue to face discrimination in law and practice, the brutal persecution and systematic violence against LGBTI+ people, and the ill treatment of asylum seekers and migrants. Before leaving the floor to the other speakers, I just want to share some ideas, food for thoughts, to animate the forthcoming discussion and come up with strategies that could improve concretely our action with respect to human rights accountability in Egypt nowadays. In response to these events around the September 20 manifestations, the European Parliament adopted a resolution condemning the state crackdown and the restriction of fundamental rights in the country. While MEP called for a profound review of the EU's relations with Egypt, however, their call was not met by the decisive action and persuasive measures from the EU, mostly due to member states' division inside the Council. It is well known, in fact, that for the EU and its member states, Cairo is an indispensable ally in the Mediterranean and central economic partner and a key element in the management of migration flows and other major regional crises. Economic and trade interests should not persuade the EU to remain silent in the face of this tragic reality. We can and we must do more to put pressure on Cairo, both politically, commercially, economically, with all the possible means the EU can adopt. We should put high-ranking Egyptian officials on notice that the EU stands ready to address serious and systemic human rights violation, ensure accountability and restore the respect for human rights in light of the European Parliament resolution of the 24 October 2019. The human rights situation in the country requires a serious revision of the Commission's budget support operation to ensure that the EU funds do not contribute to human rights violation, to undermine human rights, and in general that their involvement of the independent civil society will continue and will be a key components of EU finance and economic engagement with Egypt. On the other hand, a clean break in all relations with Egypt would be an irrational and damaging solution for Europe. Concrete results on the field of human rights indeed can only be achieved by intensifying and not by interrupting the dialogue with the country. Our countries have long shared partnership with Egypt that is based on mutual interest. Now it's the moment to rise this dialogue and to base that on mutual values, not just on mutual interest. Ensuring fundamental rights and freedoms as enshrined by the Egyptian constitution and international human rights treaties to which we are all signatory is essential to this partnership. However, only maintaining a constant dialogue with Egypt, only using all the possible means of commercial and economic pressure, and also putting in question the funds that has been raised by the Commission on the budget support, will make possible to demand eventually respect for those commitments that has been taken. In 2020, when negotiating new partnership priorities with Egypt, the EU should insist on placing its core values at the center of the partnership and at obtaining stronger and more concrete commitments for Egypt on these issues, as well as ensure better action, cooperate with and support the Egyptian national authorities drafting of legislation aimed at introduce legal amendments to the death penalty and to laws that violated the rights of freedom of assembly and expression, in establishing also a national mechanism against torture, and in carrying on the process of investigation into human rights violation in order to remove any misunderstanding and avoid allegation of arbitrary detention and increase transparency overall in the system. Finally, the European Union should definitely work on this exercise of double standards when it comes to human rights. If you want to be credible when, as a collective body, we demand that non-EU countries address their human rights violation, we should also avoid turning a blind eye when human rights are violated by our strategic or economic partners or within the EU itself. You are probably aware of this massive fight and debate about Poland and Hungary, especially in those days for the close of conditionality. Every time that the EU proves to be strong with the powerless and weak with the powerful, every time we let geopolitical or economic consideration prevail over the principles on which the Union is founded, we are eroding a little bit of that credibility that allows us to be incisive in our action as a champion of human rights. The European Union action is based on a strong commitment to promoting and protecting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law worldwide. Human rights are at the heart and must be at the heart of EU relations with any country and region. Therefore, first of all, we must be extremely strict with regard to the compliance and observance of fundamental rights within the EU. Strengthening human rights within the EU and its foreign policies are two totally separate enterprises with different challenges and different instruments, but progress in each surely reverberates in the other. I look forward also this important discussion we are having today. You can count on the engagement, on the support of the European Parliament that always showed to be the European institution more committed in this regard. And also, we must take in account that we will continue to raise our voice. We will not let the Egyptian civil society alone in this fight for democracy.
Can I say something? Or
Mr. Castaldo, thank you for your invaluable contribution. Now I give the floor to Dr. Peaknell, tackling the closure of the political sphere and the public space in Egypt.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but before you, Ms. Franchoisi wanted to say something. I didn't hear anything. I don't know. I think you are muted.
here we are. I'm muted now. I just wanted to thank Mr. Castaldo for his last words, because I think it is extremely important on that the Parliament takes a stand, and he has just to us what the Parliament is doing. My points I will develop later. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Franchoisi. It's a pleasure to hear that.
Yes, now I give the floor to Dr. Peaknell.
Thank you very much. So I would like to develop further today on the closure of the political sphere and public space in Egypt, which Vice President Castaldo has already mentioned briefly. I'd like to emphasize the rollback of democracy in Egypt, which has increased and accelerated since 2018, in particular with the presidential election of 2018, the 2019 constitutional amendment process, and the sham 2020 legislative elections, which are still ongoing. These events involved a very broad and general denial of citizens' right to genuine and free participation in public affairs, and undermined the little that remained of the separation of powers and of the rule of law. In 2017, 2018, 5 would-be candidates were prevented from running in the 2018 presidential election against the incumbent Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Finally, a relative unknown person registered on the last possible day to stand for election against the Sisi, and he had been a member of the campaign for Mr. Sisi's re-election until the day before. All this was happening in the very harsh closure of public space and the media, and also of on freedoms of assembly and association, all this preventing any would-be opposition candidates, even if they had managed to participate, from effectively organizing and mobilizing citizens for their campaigns. At this occasion in 2018, the media, democratic opposition forces, and human rights defenders then faced harsh retaliation for speaking up about the sham electoral process, which led to el-Sisi officially receiving 97% of the vote. The next year in 2019, the authorities forced through a series of constitutional amendments to further extend el-Sisi's time in power beyond 2 presidential terms of office, to constitutionalize the executive's authority to appoint judicial leadership, to grant the military custodianship power over Egypt's constitution and democracy, and to enshrine the expanded jurisdiction of military tribunals over civilians within the constitution itself. These amendments were drafted in secrecy by the pro-Sisi parliament, and then they were put to almost immediate referendum in, again, a very harshly repressive climate, without giving voters proper access to the text itself and its meaning that they were being called to vote upon. And again, many irregularities were noted in the voting process in 2019, similarly to the presidential election in 2018. Overall, there was very little credibility in the entire process. I'd like to recall that the Egyptian authorities have often referred to Egypt's 2014 constitution as proof that Egypt is on the right track towards democracy and the rule of law. But many policies of the last 4 years, and in particular these amendments, have really undermined the little that could possibly remain of that argument. In 2019, right after the constitutional amendments, rights defenders, academics, journalists, opposition party members from the democratic left and center were planning or beginning to plan a campaign for something called the HOPE, left and center opposition coalition, in order to try to contest the 2020 legislative elections. However, they were rounded up and detained in 2019 by national security prosecution on vague and unsubstantiated charges, while government-aligned media spoke of the HOPE conspiracy. Among them, human rights defender and former parliamentarian Ziad al-Halimi, and a number of other prominent journalists, activists, academics. Ziad and several others were later added to Egypt's terrorist persons and entities list in 2019. Many of the HOPE detainees, HOPE case detainees, remain behind bars today, a year and a half later, as Egypt has already finished orchestrating these legislative elections. The turnout, even based on official figures, around which there is quite a bit of doubt, the turnout is still very low. There are reports of extensive vote buying, fraud, intimidation by security bodies in the first and second geographical phases of the People's Assembly election. It's important to retain from all this that these are not representative elections. There is no competition, and the candidates standard for election are essentially standing within lists that are organized and formed ultimately by the security bodies. These are all steps through which the Egyptian authorities have been closing down the legally permissible channels for peaceful rotation of power and transition in Egypt, as well as the peaceful and legally permissible channels for citizens to express grievances and to push for any kind of policy change or reform. People understand this well, as demonstrated by the gradual decrease in voter turnout since 2014, indicating that Egyptians are losing hope in political participation and mobilization for change through the ballot box in the system and conditions as they stand. The summer 2020 Senate election clearly seems to have been barely noticed and met with near total apathy. Similar feelings were a key driver of the 2011 uprising in Egypt. And it's important to note that at the time there was relatively more space for the expression of dissent than there is today. It's remarkable, therefore, that, as Mr. Castaldo noted, people dared to take to the streets again and protest in September 2019, facing the severe risk of being arrested, of being forcibly disappeared, possibly tortured, locked up arbitrarily for years, and for simply exercising their theoretically constitutionally protected right to peaceful assembly and expression. In these demonstrations, where people were expressing anger and frustration over corruption at the top of the executive and the hardship and very tough conditions of living that they were experiencing, people were defying some very repressive laws that in Egypt severely restrict the right to peaceful assembly. So the legal framework in Egypt basically means that it is forbidden to organize a demonstration or strike or any kind of mass peaceful assembly without a permit from the Interior Ministry, who basically does not approve such permits for anything that is not an enthusiastic endorsement of the executive's policy and performance. There are also there's also another law banning peaceful assembly that dates from 1914, a law that was enacted under the British colonial powers and that remains on the books until today, and is still used to criminalize these the rights to peaceful assembly and expression. The September 2019 protests were met again with a massive and brutal crackdown, at least 4,400 arrested or forcibly disappeared, including journalists, lawyers, political dissidents, and thousands of ordinary citizens, of whom hundreds remain behind bars today in appalling conditions. Some over 400 persons, of whom a number of those arrested in September 2019, actually received a release order a couple of weeks ago by a judge in Egypt. But it seems that most, if not all of them, actually remain behind bars, either because the release order has not been processed at this day, to this day, or because they've actually been charged again in a new case with a new number, but with similar charges or identical charges to the preceding ones, in a practice that's known in Egypt as recycling cases, tadwir al-qadiyya, in which national security prosecution ensures that political prisoners or perceived dissidents, be they real or perceived, remain behind bars arbitrarily and been used to justify their detention so far. Among the defenders, journalists, and the known figures arrested in 2019 were a number of human rights lawyers, including Hamad al-Baqir, Mahnour al-Masri, others whose work is very much needed to actually defend all the other persons who are arbitrarily arrested, disappeared today. Yet they remain behind bars and are facing new charges in a recycled case, case number 855 of 2020. This year in 2020, on the anniversary of last year's demonstrations, some protests broke out again. Like in 2019, the authorities arrested hundreds of protesters and bystanders. Independent Egyptian rights NGOs documented almost 1,000 arrests in 21 governorates across the country, including at least 72 children, some as young as 11. The real number may be much higher, as these numbers are the documented and verified cases. Lawyers reported that among these, several dozen were first forcibly disappeared before reappearing before prosecutors. All this shows once again how deeply the Egyptian authorities continue to fear mass protests and peaceful mobilizations. However, it also shows that the Egyptian public, citizens, have not given up on claiming fundamental rights and freedoms, but the authorities are forcing them to pay a very heavy price in order to call peacefully for those rights and to call for reform and changes in policies. This is obviously a cause for concern when you close down all the peaceful channels to express dissent, to express grievances, and to ask for a change in policy. Then you cause an inherently unstable situation where people have no space to try to improve the system peacefully and to try to act collectively through constructive engagement. And this may drive people to act in a more disorganized way, in a more chaotic and less peaceful way in the future. Thank you.
Dr. Pekmal, thank you very much. As we know, freedom of expression in Egypt is highly exposed to so many restrictions. To shed light on that, we would love to hear from Ms. Franchoisi.
Okay, I have to, yes, undo.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Unmute. Yes, you can hear me. Okay, very good. Excellent. Well, I thank you, Ms. Pekmal, for all the great information given us, because I was particularly interested in the freedom field, because I'm a journalist and I feel very much, very strongly for the situation of journalists. And when I read in the report that Egypt is one of the worst jailers of journalists in the world, the third worst jailer, I felt very strongly, because I think criticism should be allowed in the press. If you can criticize the government, you can criticize, and it's not the journalist that is at fault. So they have blocked all the human rights websites, all the defenders of human rights in Egypt, and this is absolutely unacceptable. And there are, I don't know how many now. I was at the number of 30 journalists behind bars, but maybe there are even more. You may correct me, Leslie Pekmal, if there are more, but I fear there are more. There are, one of the worst is Turkey, for journalists behind bars, but maybe many are in Egypt. There are many journalists who are also executed. So I think it's a situation that I don't think we can accept. This is why I appreciated the words of Mr. Castaldo, because the parliament has been fairly vocal about this. My point was that the European Union doesn't seem to have done much against just situation in Egypt, and I think we should. And thank you also for Democracy Center for Transparency, because you are pushing this subject, and I think we should be a bit more vocal on the situation in Egypt, because it's a great country, a country of great history, art, and etc. And if we think of all the links that we have with Egypt, it is appalling to think that we are in this situation, and it would be also good to hear what Mr. Tarek Mahmoud is saying about the condition of the press. We feel very strongly about, I personally, because I'm a member of an association in Italy that defends the rights of journalists. In particular, it's called Oxygen for Information, and they write the stories of all the journalists that are victimized in Italy and also in other parts of the world. Victimized means that the journalist stops writing what he knows, and it just, they could write about other things, but not about the important issue that are relevant for in a country. And this is why Mr. Castaldo mentioned the story, and the terrible story of Giulio Regeni, this young Italian who was a student, and he had gone there covered by a university, a British university. He was doing a PhD on specific issues, and contact people in order to collect information about for his dissertation, and he got killed because he had contacted. We don't know why. We don't know what. We don't know anything about this, because in spite of all the effort on behalf that the European that the Italian authorities have done, and also the Parliament, European Parliament, has inquired about this story. No information has come out. Maybe Mr. Mahmoud knows more about it. I don't know if he wants to say something about this story. But for us, for me, it was doubly an enormous problem, this story, because it shows that there is not only lack of freedom of information, but the whole university system depends on Austrian for the future of a country like Egypt, that we all love, but we love Egypt, not its government. So I want to invite all the people who have interest in the freedom of the press. I want to underline the fact that this is one of the most important issues in a democratic Europe, and Europe has to be to insist on this point. We cannot have agreements. We cannot accept that that we deal with treats the press in the way that they have treated, by imprisoning them, by killing them, or extrajudicial, or after a trial. So I think we should not stop remembering all the stories that come out of Egypt, and inviting people to talk more about this, and inviting the authorities in Europe to be more aware of this, apart from the Parliament that has been really good in keeping the issue alive. And I'll be at disposal also for future contacts, and activities and writing about it because that's important. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me anyway.
Ms. Françoise, we appreciate your contribution. Thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Mahmoud is invited now to speak about the freedom of expression and the freedom of religion in Egypt.
The policy of El-Sisi is very simple. It's based on.
You have to increase more.
The sound is not.
Now
Yeah, the sound a little bit
you can
higher.
increase
That's
a bit the
very good.
microphone. Yes, thank you.
That's very good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
The policy of El-Sisi is very simple. It's based on divide to conquer. It is doing it inside of Egypt. It is doing it outside of Egypt, dealing with the European Union, with everyone. And one of the amazing things that he's always, for example, with Regini case, they are accusing everyone of international conspiracy to bring Egypt down. I don't know how it could be, but anyway, this is the case. Regarding the situation of the freedom of expression and the journalist, the number of, to my knowledge, till now is about 90 journalists imprisoned in Egypt. The number of the journalists who had been killed till now, they are since 2011. They are about 12 or 13 journalists. The problem that all of them, or most of them, they are not. They are only accused and held in prison without any judicial procedure. And this is really amazing, because I remember when Mubarak was jailed, they released him because there is a limit, a time limit, if he is not brought to justice. But in the case of journalists and others, this does not exist. The same principle cannot apply on them. About Regini, it's really very. I think it's a model how the authorities in Egypt behave when they feel there is a threat. They felt there was a threat because he was attending meetings of the trade unions, and especially, even he was talking about with some of them, especially the garbage collectors, why they don't have a union. And this question immediately threatens the authorities, because they don't trust union workers. So for me, it was not only the brutal assassination of Regini, but we forget that 5 innocent people later on had paid the price for this murder. 5 people, 5 innocent people, they accused them, and they after killing them, they pretended that they have found the documents of Regini, his passport. I don't know what else they have found. Many things of his. So it means without any doubt that the authorities were implicated in the murder. You cannot provide such documents without being implicated. But we talk only about Regini. I hope that we talk also about the 5 others that they were killed. They are not numbers. They are also names. And which really makes the situation, also for the Egyptians, that the only person who can count are the European. No, it is not only the European, because we have about at least 60,000 political prisoners inside of Egypt. At least 60,000. It's, yes, we are talking about 100 million people, but at the same time, 60,000 opponents inside, it has no meaning. And it's easy now to accuse someone of belonging to the Muslim Brotherhood. Everyone belongs now. When you raise your voice, it's immediately you are part of the opposition, and there is no opposition for them except the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not true. We forget that the Muslim Brotherhood came to power because of the army. The army led them. We are forgetting till now. El-Sisi is manipulating everyone, the Muslims, the Christians. He's making the Christians afraid of the Muslims, and he's making the Muslims afraid of the Christians in Egypt. It's a game. It's a game. It's the same what he's doing in Sinai. People in Sinai are, they feel they are not anymore part of the Egyptian people. What they are suffering from. And this is really crazy. When the army, who are supposed to protect all the Egyptian people, are doing the contrary. Let us not forget what happened when the army bombarded the Mexican tourists. And they are doing the same in Sinai. Every day. It's shameful. And you don't see it in the news in Europe, or even inside the everyday the commission briefing. Nobody talks about it. Nobody cares, because Italy wants to sell their products. German, France, he has giving territorial advantages to Greece. So there is a pressure inside the European Union not to talk about what is happening in Egypt. But when there will be an explosion, I wonder what the European Union will do. Because it will be a catastrophe, it will be a massacre, it will be an immigration that nobody can believe it. Nobody can believe it, and know how. So we must think about the future, what the future will be, because the future is very dark for everyone. We are talking about exporting terrorism. It will be, for me, I know it will be a catastrophe. I hope it won't come to this, but this is the future. It's a very dark future. Nobody knows exactly what is going on, and why there is this also forced disappearance in Egypt. a policy without no meaning, like the case of Mustafa al-Naggar, who disappeared in September 2018. Nobody knows about him. Nobody knows what happened to him. We must talk also about, lately they are arresting not the journalists themselves, but they are arresting one of their families. There is two cases, two cases. It's really, they are putting people under pressure without no reason. I think there must be a sort of a wake-up call for the European Union to act, because it's a direct neighbor and a very important neighbor. And let us not forget one important thing: the influence of Egypt on the whole Arab world. We are forgetting this. There is no democracy in the Arab world without Egypt. We cannot deny hundreds of years of influence. So I hope there will be something new. I will end my remark to this, and if there is any questions, I am willing to answer them. Thank you.
Mr. Mahmoud, thank you very much for your contribution. I want to ask if anyone would like to add something. Ms. Francoise, you are muted. We cannot hear you.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank Tarek Mahmoud for his words, which are really, you can feel that it is really suffering for the situation of his country, and we very much sympathize for what he's been saying. But I wanted to take over from his last words. I mean, Europe should care about Egypt, should take Egypt into its own hands. This is why one of my points was that Europe has not done much to help Egyptians in the last year, in the last few years, I only saw that the Parliament, European Parliament, has been active. That's why I wanted to thank Mr. Castaldo for what European Parliament has been doing. On the other hand, we need also action. We need some concrete action to try to find a solution. I mean, we can criticize, and then, like some countries that also Tarek Mahmoud has mentioned, and then we go and sell weapons to Egypt or sell other things, and we have to be consistent with our principles, and therefore, if we want to help Egyptians, we have to create a European coordinated strategy, and that's what I think is a very important point that was made here. And after all also condemned, sentenced to death, children. I mean, how can you do this sort of thing? And Mr. Mahmoud mentioned family members of journalists being also kidnapped. So Europe should really underline and should really come up with a specific, a special plan to underline the point that have already been made. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Francoisi, for your last contribution. And I would like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to potential cooperation in the future. It has been such a pleasure to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.